Hello, everyone. Good evening. I am Carol Armstrong, professor of art history at Yale, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first evening of the conference, Woman/Artist. So long in the planning and in the awaiting. As most of you know, it was to have been last December in person, but was postponed because of the pandemic, and is now a hybrid event with our keynote lecturer and Wagner and Yale speakers in person, and others, all of whom have been through Yale as students or faculty at one time or another, presenting remotely and streamed to the audience as a webinar and recorded as such as well. We would, of course, all have liked to be here in person, but it was not to be, and we hope you will bear with us as we navigate the imperfect technology. I'm not sure, but I think we're at least among the first conferences at Yale to try out a hybrid format. So depending on how it goes, we're either hapless guinea pigs or some kind of avant-garde. Before we proceed, let me commence with a land acknowledgement. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Chattahoochee, Golden Hill, Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking peoples, have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. And the Department of the History of Art would like to share a link if you wish to make a direct material contribution to a local Indigenous organization. Can we put that, is that up on the screen? Yeah, okay, great. All right, so Woman Artist is offered in conjunction with the Yale University Art Gallery's exhibition On the Basis of Art, 150 Years of Women at Yale, and in recognition of the 50th anniversary of coeducation at Yale College and the 150th anniversary of the arrival of the first women students to the university, who were enrolled in what was then called the Yale School of Fine Arts, which admitted women from the beginning. On the Basis of Art, beautifully curated by the excellent team of collaborators headed by Elizabeth Hodomarsky, the Sutphin family curator of prints and drawings at the Yale University Art Gallery, was also postponed due to the pandemic. Opening this past September and set to close in January, this exhibition of the works of 79 female artists who went to the Yale School of Art, from Emma Bacon, who received her certificate of completion in 1885, to Njideka Akunyili Crosby, who received her MFA in 2011, provided the initial impetus for this conference. The aim of Woman Artist, as we have been describing it, is to interrogate the category of the woman artist famously addressed 50 years ago in Linda Nochlund's groundbreaking essay of 1971, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? And newly the subject of intense curatorial and art market interest across the globe. In Nochlund's essay, the woman artist was largely a white, Western, naturalized category. But with the critiques addressed to the category of woman, from Black feminism, from third and fourth wave feminisms, from post-colonial and queer theory, and from the LGBTQ and other global communities, we must ask the question, what is the meaning and utility of the category woman artist now? There can be no one unanimous answer to that question. Instead, this conference asks some of the generations of women who have passed through Yale's portals since 1869 and 1969, as students and or faculty, as artists, architectural, literary and art historians, and philosophers of gender, to address the question of the modern and contemporary woman artist. We will do this beginning tonight with the keynote lecture, and then in the next 2 days, in a series of 4 panels of dedicated presentations, interspersed with conversations with 4 of the artists whose work is included in On the Basis of Art, and concluding with a video and conversation with Julia Trotta, the granddaughter of Linda Nochlund, who taught in the History of Art department at Yale between 1989 and 1992. So 20 years ago, in 2001, Linda Nochlin revisited her famously sarcastic question in a paper subtitled 30 Years After, given at a conference called Women Artists at the Millennium that was co-hosted by the Department of Art and Archaeology and the Program in the Study of Women and Gender at Princeton University, where I was teaching then. At the time, I remember someone quipping, "Oh, we should do this every 5 or 10 years or so." Well, it's not 5 or 10, but rather 20 years later. In revisiting the question once again, 50 years after, we want to put pressure on both the terms woman and artist and the relationship between them, hence the slash in the title. At the same time, in view of the splendid work in the art gallery exhibition and in line with its title, On the Basis of Art, whose language comes from the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution, stating that no citizens will be deprived of the right to vote on account of sex, and also the passage of Title IX, stating that federal funding would be denied to institutions that discriminated on the basis of sex. We also want to honor the indisputable fact of there having been plenty of great women artists, whatever we now mean by that phrase. And yet, we want to underline as well the ongoing work and unfinished process of achieving justice where gender and its intersecting social categories are concerned, at a moment in history when such progress is increasingly under threat. I would like to thank our co-sponsors, the Yale University Art Gallery's Martin A. Ryerson Lectureship Fund, the Yale Center for British Art, and the Whitney Humanities Center. And my heartfelt thanks go not only to all the participants in the conference, but especially to my co-organizers, Joanna Fiducia and Marina Malarski-Beck, to our tech support, especially to Mary Ellen Lyons, who has worked tirelessly alongside Marina in making this happen. And by the way, Marina is also responsible for the brilliant poster design for the conference. And last but not least, to the present chair of the department, Millette Geifman, for her generosity and support, along with Tim Berenger, who gave the thumbs up to all of this when he was chair. And of course, to Nicole Chartier, the indefatigable senior administrative assistant for our department, without whom none of this would be possible. And now let me introduce Anne Middleton Wagner, class of 71, who was among the very first women to come to Yale as undergraduates, which she did in 1969. 100 years after women were first admitted into the Yale School of Art. Educated at Smith College, Yale, Brown University, and Harvard, where she received her PhD in 1980, Anne Wagner has taught at Vassar College, MIT, and since 1991 at the University of California, Berkeley, where she and I first crossed paths. Since 2010, she has been class of 1936 chair emerita at Berkeley, and has lived in London since then, where she has been visiting professor at the Courtauld, as well as visiting distinguished professor at the University of York. In 2012, she co-curated Lowry and the Painting of Modern Life at Tate Britain with T.J. Clark. Its catalog was included among the best art books of 2013 by the Financial Times. In 2017, she and Clark curated Pity and Terror, Picasso's Path to Guernica, a major exhibition mounted by the Reina Sofia to mark the bombing of the Basque capital. From 2013 to 2020, she was a trustee of the Henry Moore Foundation. Among Anne Wagner's influential essays are studies of Charles Ray's figurative sculpture, Anthony McCall's 1970s drawings, and Rosemary Trockel's creative range. Her essays have appeared in Art Forum, Representations, October, London Review of Books, and Threepenny Review. Her books include Jean-Baptiste Carpeau, Sculptor of the Second Empire, published by Yale University Press in 1986. Three Artists, Three Women, published by University of California Press in 1996. Mother Stone, The Vitality of Modern British Sculpture, published by the Paul Mellon Center in 2005. And A House Divided, on Recent American Art, published by the University of California Press in 2012. She is currently writing a book to be titled Sculpture and the Making of the Human. But let me single out three artists, three women, above all, whose fine-grained complex analysis of the oeuvres of Georgia O'Keeffe, Lee Krasner and Eva Hesse, has had such an important impact on all those interested in navigating the question of the woman artist, not least by putting the woman part of the equation in parentheses, by insisting on the art first, and yet at the same time by addressing her head-on the vexed relationship between these artists' works and their gendered lives. I look forward to hearing what she has in store for us in her keynote address, toughly titled Identity in Parenthesis, or the Unspeakable Male. Please join me in welcoming her to the stage so that she can kick off our 2.5 days of discussion of the questions surrounding the woman artist. Anne?
I want to begin by thanking Carol Armstrong and by asking the slide projectionist to find the beginning of the program and not the middle of it, which is slide 1. There we go. I want to begin again by thanking Carol, the Department of History of Art at Yale University, and all the people, the many, many people who have clearly worked enormously hard to bring off what is an enormously complicated event. And finally, I want to thank them for inviting me to be the keynote speaker and to give it in person, which I didn't think, as Carol said, was going to be possible. It means everything to me to be here today. And I can tell you that since I came to Yale, my entire intellectual life has been passing before me. I found myself back in the slide room when I first talked to Vincent Scully, and I said to him, tell me, Professor Scully, how do you develop a critical eye? And he told me that's the kind of person that he was. I've thought of all my teachers. I've named them off one by one, and I'm thrilled that that history is present to me 50 years later, thanks to this invitation. Thrilled and just as honored as is possible. So with that, there was parenthesis. I did have those before, I'm sorry to say. This is a paper about misogyny, particularly its implications for women's art. I hope that no one will be surprised to hear that these implications are many, given that the hatred of women is not simply a real-life phenomenon, a recurrent characteristic of the present social order, but also equally embedded in the world of images, including those we classify as art. Why such a distasteful topic, you ask? All too predictably, there are several reasons, starting with the current tenor of Anglo-American public life. For the last several years, women in both the United States and the United Kingdom, the two cultures I know most about, have been living through and often objecting to an unusually florid display of masculine privilege, too often in the guise of violent sexual assertiveness. Now I need to be reminded how to advance the slides. Is it like that? No. How do I advance the slides, please? Sorry about that. There they are. Not that we couldn't have anticipated them before they came on. Right. So I happen to be talking about unusually florid displays of masculine privilege all too often in the guise of violent sexual assertiveness. In the UK, there's Boris Johnson, the current Conservative Prime Minister. In the US, the former President Donald Trump. The first is a man who for years has made a mystery of the number of children he has fathered, while the latter's notorious assertions of sexual privilege, his claim to grabbing rights, shall we say, brought into the public realm an outrageously aggressive level of sexual entitlement. I won't say more. So I declared when I wrote this lecture at home in London. And then overnight, there's more to say. Once again, the reproductive rights of American women are being threatened with curtailment. With this news, yet another feature of a darkening landscape. When the actions of national leaders are paralleled, as has so recently been the case in the UK, by strikingly savage crimes against women, crimes that saw kidnapping, rape, murder, necrophilia, and dismemberment committed by serving police officers, no less. A feeling of threat laced with debasement is hard to avoid. As these recent statistics indicate, they address rate of murder of women, all ages. Far from mere figments, such worries are real. Yes, there are countries and regions with low rates of femicide: Canada, Chile, Libya, most of Europe, China, Australia, and New Zealand. But there's cold comfort to be found in the relative safety of some women in light of the high rates of murder in huge swaths of the world. Misogyny's pervasiveness, then, is one of several factors that have prompted me to look again at works of art made by women with that threat in mind. What better time to turn to this topic, given the chronic persistence of male violence and female victimhood? Is it yet another toxic virus in need of a cure? Undoubtedly. And in the half century since the 1970s, many dozens of artists have thought hard about the nature of that task. All the more reason to think again about a small set of examples, 5 in total, a group chosen among other reasons because it brings out something of the range of the results that artists have achieved. First, though, I want to place us under the sign of 70s feminism, its humor, its anger, as outrageously expressed in a funny, feisty telegram sent in 1971 by the artist Nancy Sparrow to the critic Lucy Lepard. These are sort of great ancestral figures to people of my age. The enemies of women's liberation in the arts will be crushed. I love it. Brave words shared pre-internet by 2 comrades at arms during what for women was, 1971, something of a banner year. In January of 1971, Linda Nothlin, who was then aged 40 and teaching at Vassar, published "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" In June, here in New Haven, the first undergraduate class to include women, among whom I figured, received a BA. Forgive me if I mention just in passing that according to the New York Times, we received higher grades than the men. And so the lecture begins with this history, one of anger and laughter, even laughter as anger, which is one way in which women artists have always, well, often done their work. I think of the Brooklyn-born artist Martha Rossler, who has mastered both modes. On the one hand, from the series collectively titled Body Beautiful or Beauty Knows No Pain, which she worked on from 1966 to 72, there's this sublimely ridiculous pornotopia of a collage pasted together from men's magazines, so-called, and among other things, a backhanded tribute, and how, to Ingres's highly imaginative Ban Turc, which he completed in 1863, although he dated it in 1862, after years of gestation, so to speak. Rossler's collage, too, was years in the works and tracks Ingres closely in pose after pose. Yet perhaps more rigorous, if less amusing as a contribution to feminism, is her vital statistics of a citizen simply obtained, the unnerving video she wrote, produced, and performed in 1977. This is why it serves as example number one, the work that saw Rossler cast herself in the role of the eponymous citizen, a role that required her to serve as the passive object of a series of seemingly meaningless measurements collected by her white-coated collaborators, pseudo-technicians who kept careful notes. Face, 7 inches, width of 1 eye, 1.5 inches, shoulder span, 15, and on and on and on until the daft data gathering yields to the artist's voice, reading first from a seemingly endless list of crimes against women, and next a deportment manual. In the first category are terms such as rape, clitoridectomy, brutalization, pornography, sterilization, forced motherhood, outlawed abortion, illegal abortion, woman battering, and there's more. The second, which I won't take time to show you, changes tone as Rossler slips on her clean white gloves to tell us what women ought to do, how they are to sit, to stand, to dress, to walk, and so on. Both lists are long. Both concern female objectification. Each reflects the other in reverse. At some point, the penny drops. The two conceptual tracks within Rossler's video are showing us how dialectics work. Where does this take us? As Jacqueline Rose insists in her most recent book on violence and on violence against women, a book published this year, there's a poison in the air and it is spreading. This poison, she continues, is sanctioned violence, violence elevated to the level of licensed pleasure. No prizes for guessing that she too is thinking of the public conduct of powerful men, among them the disgraced producer Harvey Weinstein, joining Trump, and Johnson near the top of the list. What now? As the incomparable Judy Chicago insisted, change can only begin to happen when women transform our circumstances into our subject matter, to use them to reveal the whole nature of the human condition. This is a piece of wisdom which has become very vivid and important to me as I've thought over this paper. And this is why I'm going to read the nub of it again. Chicago insisted that change can only begin to happen when women transform our circumstances into our subject matter, to use them to reveal the whole nature of the human condition. I can't actually think of a much better definition of what feminism is and how it should operate. I think countless females have shared Chicago's view, yet it seems that not everyone gets the message. Evidently, grabbing rights are hard to give up. Yet, to deploy the verdict of Lucy Lepard, as published in 1980, feminism matters, still matters, as neither a style nor a movement. Instead, it's an ideology, a value system, a revolutionary strategy, a way of life. I have really think that one of the sort of rituals of feminist practice, as I came up, was to honor one's mothers. And both the mothers I'm quoting now, I think, deserve and have my honor, at least. In any event, by this invigorating route, we are going to arrive at example 2. Half a century ago, women rallied publicly under banners proclaiming key demands, none more vehement than take back the night. In fact, there's a whole Take Back the Night organization now, which tracks all of these demonstrations of the kind you're seeing on the screen. And in fact, it's hard to find a more immediate instance of the transformation of circumstances into subject matter along the lines that Chicago prescribed. The slide that I'm showing you now is a rally in Boston, 1979. One of the earliest events that met this description was before that, in 1975, at a march held in Philadelphia after the murder of a microbiologist who was stabbed to death walking home. As a result, a genre was born. This is the march in Boston, as I've said, the same year that there was a major action here in New Haven. Like those that followed, it brought women together in their thousands, intent to use another charged phrase, intent on reclaiming the streets. As some will have noticed, collective protest seems to be yet another example of the sort of work, women's work, we should call it, that is never done. This is a truth that leads to 3 weeks in May, a performance piece conceived and conducted by the American artist Suzanne Lacy. Once you understand the structure of the piece, it's easy to see why its duration was fixed in advance. During the weeks in question, this was in '77, Lacy went daily to the central office of the Los Angeles Police Department to collect information on the most recently reported rapes, including where and when they occurred. Then she took that data back outdoors, out to the site, though perhaps we should say non-site, borrowing a term from Robert Smithson, in order to record by means of a graphic outline where the crime had occurred. A non-site, according to Smithson, can't be located. And this, of course, isn't locatable because the rape is an absence inflicted at that spot. Now, I very much am aware that the site of the rape, recording the site of a rape, isn't the same thing as stopping such crimes entirely. But doing nothing does nothing, as it says on the tin. Lacey's piece clearly helped to foster other acts of witness, slut walks around them. This time-honored tactic, the slut walk, gets women out onto the street in protest, performing more acts of witness to what must be said. That time-honored tactic has recently been revived by feminists in India to address the pernicious and persistent habit of blaming the victims of assault. You know, that she got what was coming to her point of view. Hence, this classic slut walk sign. Don't tell us how to dress, tell the men not to rape. I could tell you, I can promise you that if you go online and search these events, go onto the Take Back the Night website, you will be staggered just how many times this slogan, this ritual has occurred. And fascinatingly, now in India, very, very recently. All of these events, the protests, the placards, the speeches, are essential to my story. They belong to feminism, to the history of protest, and to art history. This last, not least, because they occurred at a time when the discipline was moving towards a falling of boundaries, a renewal of forms. Remember that Linda Nochlin, bless her, published Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists in 1971, the year that, among other things, was the one in which the first female Yaleys, myself included, were awarded the BA. All these things have shaped my work on women artists, while also demonstrating that misogyny has yet to die. From here, it's a short step to the life and work of Lee Krasner, born Leonore. I think again of the fraught engagement with femininity her shortened name indicates, and the hackles raised among contemporary dealers at the very idea of women artists. I think of her angry battle with the bland passivity built into female stereotypes, words like attractive and desirable, words that assume the male gaze. Hence, my next example, which is here. Oops, oh, there they all are, sorry guys. Is my next example, the looming presence that is Krasner's painting Prophecy from 1956, which among other things makes no concessions to femininity's familiar masquerade. All voids and vulvas, it seems, rooted to the painting's edge, thereby claiming a stable rootedness, an implacable force. Perhaps this is precisely what Prophecy points to, a way of being that doesn't resemble the seemingly hysterical deportment of de Kooning's Woman One from 1952. That figure stares and kicks and seems to float. Her astonishingly painted breasts look both empty and full. Krasner's creature, by contrast, holds a position she seems ready to defend. No wonder, given how much the 1950s studio context so routinely cast women in the defensively passive mode. These two images, yeah, I think you'll know them both. This one of de Kooning in the studio with Elaine, his wife, Elaine de Kooning, and then this one with Pollock, whoops, rats, why are these going? Oh, I'm sorry, they are doing exactly what I want them to, which is to be side by side so that we can see the repetition of this format of the woman seated in a, how would we read these attitudes? Skeptical on Krasner's side, not a little bored on Elaine de Kooning's side, but there as kind of mascots, tokens, belongings of the men who are doing the painter's job. No wonder, then, that when Krasner moved away from engaging the topic of women, she took on large-scale works. Works on the order of the eye is the first circle, which I am showing you now, which she completed in 1960. Its title, as Ellen Landau points out, is the first line of an essay by Ralph Waldo Emerson from his book about the circle as a pure primal form. For Krasner, however, purity and the primal are clearly at odds. Her painting is a whirlwind, storming across the canvas, and in the process evoking dust, earth, feces, and then moving on at once to the very idea of marking as soiling. All of this seems to saturate the canvas, taking one's breath. Speaking of breath, I shall take a breath and I shall have a glass of my water, a sip of my water. This blank slide is a pause also for reflection. Perhaps it's Krasner's violence as I wrote this paper that made me realize that it's time to return to my central question and ask, why speak of violence at all? Why address subjects like scatology, battery, death? To this, I can find only one answer. How can we not? There's an argument, a serious one, that for a woman to represent the hateful, indeed murderous forces directed at her, forces bent on her real or psychic destruction, for a woman to represent this reality, no tactic should be barred. And yet, real questions follow. Take the familiar consent conundrum, recently restated by the art historian Nancy Princenthal, who's the author of Unspeakable Acts, Women, Art, and Sexual Violence in the 1970s. How, this is the question, how can rape be differentiated in visual representation from consensual sex? The answer has not changed. It cannot. The ambiguity of the imagery of rape is analogous to the difficulty of adjudicating rape charges. She said, he said, only goes so far. Where visual representation is concerned, by contrast, the question is different. Do depictions of rape risk inflicting involuntary and unwanted exposure to harmful images? In the early 1970s, Princenthal writes, nothing caused greater rancor and divisiveness than graphic imagery of sexual violation, specifically anything that could be deemed pornography, which is itself notoriously difficult to define. Now, 50 years later, examples of such images have long since been elevated to the feminist canon, while neither solving this conundrum nor blunting their force. Take the early and still notorious performances of the young Cuban-American artist Ana Mendieta, born 1948, made as coursework during her time as a graduate student in the Distinguished Art Department of the University of Iowa. The slide on the screen barely begins to tell us how far her art would go. This is part of a performance piece in which she invited her cohort come by her apartment, and what they saw there was this display, as it were. This first instance was this display of chicken blood and sawdust and things that would coagulate there outside the door. I just said to you that the slide barely begins to tell us how far her art would go, nor does it entirely explain why I have chosen it as my example 4. Let me explain. Although her art was indeed produced as coursework, it was also made in the spirit of protest and addressed to a campus being wrought by the rape and murder of a female nursing student, allegedly by a fellow student, a Black man who, though innocent, was tried, convicted, and made to serve 10 years in prison before his exoneration. Now, Mendieta's final piece, let it be said, didn't directly reference these circumstances. There was no dormitory setting, no trial, no racist conviction. Instead, she produced and enacted a tableau vivant, setting it inside her apartment on Moffett Street and inviting friends and fellow students to stop by. Those who did became viewers of a scene that even today is not for the faint of heart. I'm asking you to take this as a trigger warning because it is truly hard to take. Some of you may prefer not to look. Those who do will see a carefully staged scene, focused on the artist, viewed from behind, while bent and bound to a table amid signs of a fight. Her trousers are down around her ankles and her legs and bottom look bloody. Thanks to body paint, nothing more. So this is the piece. You know, have a care. It's really a disturbing piece and entirely enact the scene of violence, the crockery on the floor. We're looking at a carefully conceived and enacted setting. Why make such a piece? Why show it to an audience then or now? One reason is that, like so many other feminist works and actions, its origins lie in protest, however misplaced. As such, it can't help but bring home the reality that the rape and murder of women are hardly a thing of the past. They haven't stopped. Yet I find myself wondering if a graduate student would be allowed to make such a work in the present day. Mendieta, alas, can have no say in the matter. In 1985, 8 months after her marriage to the sculptor Carl Andre, she fell from the 34th floor of the apartment they shared in Greenwich Village. He was charged with her murder and acquitted. 33 years later, in 2018, the New York Times ran Mendieta's obituary as part of the series they have titled Overlooked No More, an obituary that made tardy note of her career. This is the photograph they included as a portrait with that piece. And now to my fifth and final example, which admittedly is a bit of a cheat. I can't stop myself from showing two works as one, because I'm a glutton and because I want us to be now closer to the present and to see where works in this vein are now. The first then will be a piece by a Bay Area artist, a woman called Maria Porges, who graduated, as it happens, from Yale in 1975, and even more of a coincidence, happens to be on view in the Yale University Art Gallery's amazing show, which is on view now, and of which we just now had a most exciting and edifying tour. And I urge anybody who can to see the show in person, but also, if you can't, to go onto the website of that show, because all of the works in the show are represented there. And that indeed is where I first saw this piece. Porges graduated, as I said, from Yale in 1975, and the piece which is on view goes by the double-edged title, Implement of Knowledge, from 1992. What it is a found, using this description, a found and altered book with oil paint and wooden handle. As I say, if you can see it in person, it's for one thing you can't tell at all is that it is big. And by big, I mean it's, a good yard tall, and it vectors across the wall or hangs from the wall with its sense of a weapon very much in play. There's a lot to think about in this discarded book turned into a weapon. Look at it this way. This former book has been transformed into a weapon. Well, I mean, there has always been this point of view that books are weapons. Books can set you free. At the same time, this book is primitivized. In other words, it's no longer legible. It's turned into an artifact of a very different time, an artifact of violence. I was thinking when we were in the gallery that it reminds me of the old saying of we can hammer our weapons into plowshares. But here something different has occurred. Our instruments of enlightenment, books, have been turned into weapons. It's a terrible thought. Now I go to my final example, the other half of my cheat example, which is a work by Elisa Barenboim, who is a Russian immigrant who has been in the US and living in New York City for a bit more than a decade now. The work is called Process, and you can see it in a slide when it was shown in her New York gallery, White Walls. I've presented it in context so that you can get some sense of the physical importance of the work. You also need to know what it's made of, just as you do with Porges's work. Her technique is to bring together the flesh-like qualities of clay fused into ceramic with the hard surfaces and sharp edges of sheet steel. The conjunction, as one critic puts it, is as bodies enmeshed in what we might call hardware, a phrase that primes our response to the contrast of matte ceramic and hard edged steel. To my eye, that tension, a contrast, is so overtly gendered as to set me thinking of both Andre and Mendieta. It's a formal linkage which isn't easy to bring off. Amazingly enough, Barenboim manages, thanks to the opposition summoned by her media and form. Surely there's no need to return to the bodiliness of Mendieta's sculptures, but let me at least summon one of the kinds of Andres that I have in mind. Some of the sparest of his floor pieces, a work such as Magnesium Steel Couplet from 1999. I can't say that this is a reading that Barenboim intended to make this comparison to Andre. But I can say that the form of her work, it's bringing together of steel and ceramic fashioned to replicate the female reproductive system, which has been inserted into the hardness of the male, makes it clear that I can't believe I just said that. Women will conquer the world. Upside down. That's the way it's going to go, I think. Inserted, joined with the hardness of the steel. I can't say that she intended it to riff on Mendieta and Andre, but I do feel confident that the reading I have just offered of this very recent work is one that makes sense of her media and forms. And isn't this how art operates, how it makes meaning? By bringing together or opposing media and forms. I realize that with Barenboim's process, we seem to have come a very long way from the temper of the feminist artists and activists with whom I began. The tone of the art is different. Anger and desperation have given way to a kind of coolness, a kind of deadpan precision. It may well be that we, this present and not so present audience, that we sense an undertone of rage or impudence or even derision in the dialogue Barenboim has chosen to have with Andre's version of metal masculinity. But even to allow oneself to have a dialogue with Andre of all people in 2015, isn't that in itself a stepping away from the bare minimum of solidarity or sisterhood necessary after Mandela's death? These are painful, difficult questions to which I have no answer yet, but we can still describe what Barenboim has done so very coolly. A ceramic simulacrum of the female reproductive apparatus enters and is embedded in a steel sheet. One writer, a contributor to the catalog of New Time Artists and Feminisms of the 21st Century. This is the exhibition, which is now at the University Art Museum Gallery in Berkeley. One writer in that context speaks of the productive tension between fertility and violence. In what context might this be right? Let me be clear here. She's speaking of it in terms of Barenboim's work. I haven't quite brought that home to you now. As I say, I wonder what context might suggest a productive tension between fertility and violence. In my copy of the catalog, I confessed I've crossed out productive. Surely destructive is the better word. Now, I don't really have a conclusion for this paper, although it is time to begin to head for the door. I do see it, though, as fulfilling a necessary purpose, that of raising an old familiar question for artists who are women, and a fortiori for artists who are feminists. Perhaps I can best dramatize it by putting side by side, as I've done, Barenboim's process and Lee Krasner's prophecy. The compare and contrast of the two works' titles sums up, I think, a great deal about the two works' overall self-conception. Process, as title, is apparently matter of fact. It describes, I quote the dictionary, a continuous and regular action or succession of actions taking place or carried on in a definite manner and leading to the accomplishment of some result. It seems quite closely linked to its near neighbor procession, meaning, says the dictionary, the action of a body of persons going or marching along in orderly succession in a formal or ceremonial way. Formal seems right. Ceremonial, perhaps less so, yet one can see a sort of generational power in that meaning as well. I start to wonder if Barenboim expects us to feel a chill or even a cold smile at the so-called process of reproduction of the species set out, laid before us under our feet in this inorganic diagram of ceramic and steel. Maybe her sculpture is meant ultimately to raise questions, old questions about women's place or placement at ground level, down there, prone and open as usual. But if it does raise these questions, it does so in a deliberately abstract terminology in a way that seems to bode ill for the female body in the world of today. Krasner's prophecy is in a wholly other world. It is, of course, impossible for us to dissociate the title from the terrible death and sex circumstances it seemed to predict. This was the canvas that was on Krasner's easel when she returned from her first trip abroad, with Pollock having been left behind. She came home because she knew he and the passenger in his car had been killed when he totaled it one night. What she saw there, arriving in the studio, was prophecy. And the title and the two seem predictive in a horrible way. In fact, I'm told that we don't know precisely whether or not she decided on the title before the fatal car crash. If we don't know now, we never shall. But at the very least, the title and the painting it is affixed to seems to be laying claim to inspiration, to revelation. But what a truth it sees. The painting's tone is angry and ecstatic and desperate and maybe self-lacerating. And prophets are often like this. I've tried to argue that Krasner's depiction of woman, capital W, and surely the portentous capitalized abstraction is intended by the picture, even as the picture rages against abstraction. And all that abstraction does to the reality of an actual female body, that Krasner's depiction of woman, capital W, is torn between outrage and despair. I think its anger is part of its power. The other is pity. I've always thought that there was something so vulnerable in the strange face with its bloodied jaw, and it's an uncanny figure beyond belief. That uncanniness, that anger, is one part of its power. The other is pity. The two are twined together in it, marked by voids and patches of color, yet still putting its woman on two firm feet. This is one reason that the painting's tone seems so angry and ecstatic and maybe self-lacerating. Aren't prophets very often like this? I've tried to argue that Krasner's picture of woman is torn between outrage and despair. I think anger is part of its power, anger and pity intertwined. It speaks back to de Kooning's phantasm, and it was capable of doing so because it was drawn unashamedly out of the experience, Krasner's experience of not being the image of woman you were fighting with. This is all dangerous territory. Some will say too dangerous, especially for an artist as opposed to activists. Making art out of misogyny, in the face of misogyny, working with the male world's caricatures and cruelties, working to make them explode in the misogynist face. Isn't this too much to ask of art? Aren't there other grounds on which and from which artists who are women can draw? Other aspects to women's experience, less dreadful and double-edged? Well, certainly I hope so. I believe so. I almost put in an image of Bertrand Morisot, the self-portrait, right about now in order to, call us back from the brink. But we're speaking about now. We're speaking at a time when the hard-won right for control of her body, woman's body, is being threatened by something I never thought that I would live to see, by a repeal of the right to abortion. So I had to turn away. Of course, most artists cannot make art out of horror, or cannot have horror be their constant and central material. Goya is, thankfully, a special case. Mendieta also. But any art, any feminist art, that isn't continually haunted by what Mendieta's rape or Krasner's prophecy have to show, strikes me, alas, as hiding from everyday life. The particular terms that any artist makes with that life will vary, of course, but the terms proposed by feminism of the late 20th century have not, more is the pity, gone out of date. They are even more essential today.
I take it you will.
Yes, I would be happy to.
And I think it will come both from us in the room and from people online.
So feel free to raise your hand and we'll give it a minute for people to.
Yeah, anybody it would be good if people really spoke up, because I need to be able to hear.
So for those joining via Zoom, please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A feature and we will read them out loud for the speaker.
I didn't hear any of that. It's not addressed at me, I take it.
No, sorry, I was just speaking for those joining remotely.
This is part of the experimental process.
How can we tell? Are there people?
Some of us in the room start with something. I mean, I don't really have a question per se, but I have, I noticed that running, okay. I don't really have a question per se, but I noticed that, of course, running throughout the whole talk were a set of what might seem to be irreconcilable antinomies and contradictions, starting with rage and laughter, including sort of production and destruction, activism and art. And I was also thinking about a woman as victim on the one hand, and the idea of honoring one's mothers, and not as victims, but as
Progenitor.
yeah, progenitors and heroes in a way. And I surely that does have to do with some aspect, or with a kind of dialectical process that you're interested in. I don't know if you have some thoughts about that.
beyond what you've already said, but.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question, I think, because it's one that brings home to us the very real complications of life. You know, I think we are so constantly balancing contradiction just to, because the world in which we live is so complicated and demands so much adjustment, complicated, and then at the same time so simple. You know, there are so many very simple truths that have not changed at all, and they are about, you know, bare life, really. It's one of the very imponderable questions that in a time so rich and technologically advanced, we come against our primitivism so frequently, and that we find it so difficult to stop ourselves as a species, as cultures, from laying waste to everything that the world has given us, you know, the resources of our planet. We seem to be acting very slowly to move on that front. It's also the case that the dialectic that I live with, I've always found explanatory. I don't know, I don't have a better system, not being a believer, than to try to feel the push-pull of things within experience and within representation. And so, yeah, in other words, maybe what I'm saying is, yeah, that's how I see everything. That's the world for me. That's how I see. And it's how I ask myself to think, I think, as well.
All right, we have a question from the chat. One audience member asks, do you see any parallels between Barenboim's speaking back to power and the work of Hesse?
Right, could you turn on your mic now for me?
Sorry, I think that that mic might not be good. I'm sorry. Someone in the audience asked, do you see any parallels between Barenboim speaking back to power,
Yeah.
and the work of Hesse?
Ah. Well, I mean, not everybody does the job, do they? You know, Hesse speaks back to the frailty of the body, and that is maybe the ultimate power. Hesse speaks back to death. Hesse speaks back to whether she speaks back to and also enlists a kind of comedy about the objection of the body. She speaks back formally to anti-form. That's probably her biggest dialectical movement, to put form and anti-form together to make series and sequences of things that make no sense, to start with something that's beautifully clear and to tangle it as much as she can make it tangle. That's rope piece, which was a reworking of exactly an orderly conception, a kind of spider web that turned into something quite undone. So speaking about the dialectic between order and disorder, I think we're right there. And then if we overlay the body and its decomposition, then we're there twice over. Thank you for the very good question, questioner.
Thank you. We have another question. Thank you for the fascinating talk. I especially loved your invocation of Goya at the end, and I think in particular of the print titled, "One Can't Look, while nonetheless forcing us to look, which is certainly part of the project, situating the inability to not see or unsee of some of the artists you mentioned. With this question of visibility in mind, making violence against women visible, I wonder if you can speak more about the relationship between media in rendering this visibility, something you brought out beautifully in the last work. Is there something to you about a static image that forces confrontation more than time-based media? And how do time and medium come together in addressing the question of violence?
Wow. Let's see. Where's the heart of this question? Can the person can you contact that person? Or are you listening to my answer? Tell me, person, where's the heart of your question, or the two hearts?
Nina, where is the heart of your question? To be able to write further.
Or you could, I mean, my brain is not the speediest of brains. So I would love to hear it again if it's there to be read.
Yeah, it was a complex question. So again, let's hone in on the question part. So she's asking about the question of visibility and the visibility of violence against women, and wants to know about the relationship between media in rendering this visibility, and whether there's something to you about a static image that forces confrontation more than time-based media.
Yeah. I mean, time-based media is such an interesting phrase because I can't think of any medium that isn't time-based. It just so happens that drawing, and we give drawing and painting and sculpture these by now hallowed disciplinary labels, but we have no example of an instantaneous work. It's unconceivable, because we are creatures in time and we work with time. And this is kind of one of the great thoughts of the 70s land artists. They thought in time, they thought with time, they thought, and a lot of the interesting theory that they were reading about around McLuhan and Howard Innes was about time. And of course, but I think that what is really being asked is, can I talk about time-based media as, that's really all I have to say about time-based media. I mean, I think it is, really no different from the kinds of dialectical things and the kinds of traditional things which are part of art history, which is shown by the fact that art historians write about it, take it seriously. But I would love the question. Thank you.
Many questions are pouring in, but we have one in the room now, so I will pass the question briefly to an in-person participant.
I hope you will be able to hear my question. You really spoke beautifully about the tension, not only this dialectical tension that you've raised, but also the one about the one between figuration and abstraction. And I was wondering whether you could speak a little bit more about how these negotiations of violence against women implicate the viewer in their different manifestations.
Mm-hmm. I want someone to tell me what the question is, because I really can't hear very well. Well, can I do that so that I can go and hear it? Will you say it to me in like a person to person kind of thing?
My question is how this is interested in what the implications are of the viewer into these negotiations of violence in these different manifestations.
In time-based media? In these.
that you've, shown.
Right. So, well, you know, the viewer is me, it's you. The viewer is not a fixed category. The viewer can always be a putative category. And the works of art tend to suggest to us who they think the viewer is, you know, and I think it's perfectly possible to look at works of art and believe or argue that they imagine a particular kind of viewer. Like, I think it's been hard for for a long time, it was assumed that viewers of nudes, you know, were men. Well, which isn't true at all. I mean, I personally look at nudes very carefully because the female body is interesting too. But what I'm saying as an answer is that the question of the viewer and the nature of the viewer is something that the work of art has as its own business to clarify to the viewer. The viewer doesn't make up who they are, or if you do, then you are making a big mistake, that you are not performing an adequate critical task without asking the work of art to tell you. That's a little anthropomorphizing for works of art, but I mean this but I'm adopting an analogy to explain what looking is like. Looking isn't a verbal procedure, it's looking. And so therefore you have to negotiate that difference of medium and terminology. Yeah.
Another question from Sabina Kriebel.
Oh.
Says,
Hi, Sabina.
Nice to see you remotely. She says, during your talk, I kept thinking about the role of internalized misogyny and the fine and shaky line in these works between activism and reproduction of some misogynist codes. And I'm thinking about this complicated terrain and your title, Identity in Parenthesis. Can you perhaps elaborate a bit more on the work that your title is doing in this context?
I really wish I could, Sabina. I gave this title at some unimaginably distant time. And I was given a chance to stick with it or dump it at a certain moment, but I didn't have a better title. And it was really only as time passed and there were some experiences of male violence that were so outrageous in, terrible murder and rape, just unspeakable. And it and another terrible sort of misconduct, both happened, both were inflicted on women by the policemen. And they were so traumatizing, that I had to live within the title that I had appointed, had stipulated, and then do what I had to do. And part of what I had to do was reflective really on my own art history, on my past as an art historian. And part of it was reflective of my pain that we live when such terrible things happen to so many women. I mean, you know, there are so many women that we don't, I mean, this is happening to women every day. And, you know, that was part of the ethic of Suzanne Lacey's piece. You know, she went every day to the central LA police station and said, tell me about the rapes and murders of women, and boing, out she went. And, you know, to think about that, I mean, I started thinking about the unspeakability of that. And if Sabina, if you would like to write to me, I would love to hear from you, because I have such fond memories of when you were a student. End of response. Next question.
Thank you. We have another question from one of our panelists for the conference, Laura Wexler, professor here at Yale, who asks, says, thank you for the fascinating lecture. I was very moved by your description of what it is like to be back at Yale and your memories of your teachers, in particular, the generosity of Vincent Scully. I'm wondering what he said to you about how to develop a critical eye.
Yeah, well, that was 50 years ago. He said, you know, Scully was just a, you know, a magical, generous human being. He was from New Haven, which some people, maybe not everybody knows. He was, you know, kind of came from a American-Irish family. He was not a pretentious man. He was a beautiful man. He was just one of the school at that time was, had some beautiful people who, the other one was the great preacher, William Sloane Coffin. And these are the people who would stand up and bear witness at the time. At that time when I was completing my education, the campus went on strike, and which was not good for one's education, but you know, there were many rallies for political protests for what was happening to people of color, the Vietnam War. All of these things were regularly being engaged with on the campus, and everybody came out. And so finally then, you know, Kingman Brewster, who was the, what is it, a president here? The head of, what is the director, the president of the college? Sorry. Is that, nobody knows? What's the, anyway, in any event, it was Kingman Brewster. He was the one who finally went towards coeducation and made it happen. So they actually were sort of people of conscience, and they were liberals in public positions of power. And they lent a very particular tone to the time, and they had to realize that the student body felt very strongly about the war and about the conditions under which the country was conducting itself. There was a phrase at the time which spoke of blood on the streets of Wagner Library, on the steps of Wagner Library. And Wagner is the library at Harvard, and that was, you know, the kind of figure of the academic establishment being riven by student activism and refusal of the war. But I mean, luckily there weren't, you know, there were shootings at Kent State, as you probably all know.
Thank you. Another question that we have, what is the responsibility of a man artist working within a society and art world steeped in misogyny and violence? What standards do we as art historians need to hold them to?
What's a man's responsibility as an artist? This is the first one. Well, I mean, the cheap answer would be ask a man. You know, a man's responsibility as a person should be his responsibility as an artist. And his responsibility as a person is to be humane, kind, honest, generous, nonviolent, and a feminist. And if he can do that in his life, then he ought to be able to do it in his art. And if he doesn't.
I just said that was a good answer.
Maybe we have time for about one more question. We have one here. Thank you so much. You talked very much to instances of violence against women in their extremes, femicide, rape. Though, what do you make of the more subtle and common instances of violence and cruelty, like microaggressions or structural violence? What is the role of the woman artists in responding to a range of violence committed against women?
And what's the word micro what?
Microaggressions, so not overt violence that is incredibly
Not rape or
right. Not rape.
You
or
mean if
dismemberment.
like someone touches
Everyday
you up or
violence.
something?
Or violence that isn't necessarily physical, but the violence to, say to someone's career that's done by, the structure of patriarchy.
So, this is, I don't think this can be prescribed from the podium, and it really, really depends on what an individual feels capable of doing. I mean, it is hard to call people out. If you're in a meeting and somebody puts you down and actually the agenda is to decide something and get it done, then you have to have a pretty strong character to just say, no, wait a minute, let's hold on. Do you know what you just said to me? This is, there is no one answer. This is really very much a personal thing, but I think to respond to microaggressions, I mean, a human being gets fed up. You say, enough with it, or you do whatever a civilized person can do within the bounds of common, not uncommon civility, just common civility. And if you cannot, if it's really truly happening, then you go to someone who has access over, this kind of behavior. You go to the top and you complain very loudly, and you say, you have his number and you get on it. That's what you do.
Well, I think with that, we've gone slightly over our time. I want to thank you, Anne Wagner, so much for this wonderful talk, and thank you for everyone who's joined us virtually. We'll be beginning again tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. with a full day of panels, and again on Saturday. So we can once again give a virtual and present round of really heartfelt applause to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.